Okay, well, welcome to week 5. Hi, everybody out there. I was really enjoying your Enron stuff, and I've been looking through it, but not graded it yet. So hold on for that. If you haven't received your grades, that's fine. I put in a few examples of what some people had done online to give you some examples of what people had picked, and guys really picked some interesting and different ideas. So this one was a request, and it's a real a saving of negative face on this one. It's a really nice one. Hi Suzanne, I was wondering if you would do me a favor. You've sent a couple of packages to Jeff's home by UPS or FedEx. Unfortunately, Jeff is never there to sign for them, so the packages are delayed in getting to him as we have to track them down. UPS is very good about rerouting to the business address, but FedEx won't reroute. Anyway, in future, if you could send the packages to Jeff at thanks a lot, Suzanne. Hope all is well. So yeah, it was a nice example of a face-saving request. That was good. That's from Kerry. Matthew chose to look at some of the religious language that he found, and this was particularly interesting because of the irony of the fact that it's Ken Lay, who was the guy that destroyed the company and was supposed to go to prison for a very long time, but then died of a heart attack. So, oh, Mr. Lay, I'm woefully sorry. So this must have been after things started going wrong. I know you'll be talking to the employees soon, and I'll be praying for you. I was just praying and asking God what I could say. I don't want to be presumptuous. There are many afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them. You may not feel righteous right now, but you are. So I wonder if this employee had a change of heart when they found out that their entire pension had disappeared and they were worth nothing. Who knows? And the irony of Ken Lay responding, I really appreciate your email. I've relied heavily on my faith, Bible, and prayer. Which, you know, I mean, he absolutely destroyed the company and all the people that work for him, so it's hugely ironic. But that was a nice, he found a few. I've picked out one, but people that did this found a few of each of the things. Francesca, I liked, she did a few of the different kinds of greetings, but I picked out a couple. This was from an email from an employee at Enron, had these examples. This is to one guy, Ben. So you either had Ben, hey Ben, or no greeting at all. And then another group of emails from this person. She had an email from friend or family outside of Enron, Big Ben, which obviously is the joke based on London. Yeah, Big Ben in London. BR, and then hey fag boy, which is like presumably some friend or whatever, but interesting nonetheless. And then Drew picked out jokes, and he found this really long joke. So the Enron people, he had several jokes, but I picked this one. The Enron people were energy traders, right? They were trading energy back and forwards from California, and they were lying and stopping energy coming through and so on. But so they were called energy traders. This one, Sal tells me, is a very old joke, which originally is a lawyer joke, but has been adapted by this guy as a in-joke for all the energy traders at Enron. So a very successful energy trader parked his brand new Mercedes in front of his office. As he got out, a truck passed too close and completely tore off the door on the driver's side. The trader immediately grabbed his cell, dialed 911, and within a minute, a policeman showed up. Before the officer had any chance to ask any questions, the energy trading icon started screaming hysterically. His Mercedes, which he had just picked up the day before, was now completely ruined and would never be the same, no matter what the body shop did to it. When he finally wound down from his ranting and raving, the officer shook his head in disgust and disbelief. "I can't believe how materialistic you energy traders are," he said. "You're so focused on your possessions you don't notice anything else." "How can you say such a thing?" asked the trader. The cop replied, "Don't you know your left arm is missing from the elbow down? It must have been torn off when the truck hit you." "My God," screamed the master trader, "where's my road?" So this is apparently an old joke, a lawyer joke, but you know that you can sort of make it into anything you want, basically. But I love that. I love that he found a number of different. He looked for keywords like joking, laughing, laugh out loud, stuff like that, and found several of them. So I was really impressed with how creative people were with looking for that. So nice job on that first assignment, and I'll be grading that this week. And yeah, and then we'll talk in a few weeks about your second one. All right, so today you did a chapter on intention interpretation. How did you find the chapter?
The stuff that we actually sort of learned in pragmatic class.
Right. So this chapter was very close to this sort of, you know, mixed with pragmatic theories, right? So of course there is a huge overlap between pragmatics and discourse analysis. And why would that be the case?
So we're looking at context.
Yes, because we're looking at language in context. As soon as you start looking at language in context, you're looking at essentially meaning in context, which is the very broad definition of pragmatics, right? So in this area, they overlap, okay? And they overlap because we're looking at language in use. We do things with language. Language is intentional and must be interpreted. And those interpretations are guided by sociolinguistic and sociocultural expectation. That's how our interpretations are bounded, right? So this is the overlap with everything that happens with pragmatics as well. So you had 3 approaches in this chapter that she mentioned, and all 3 of them will be familiar to some of you who've taken pragmatics, but it's fine if you haven't, because we're going to look at them here. So the first one is speech act theory, right? So essentially it's interpretations of action in speech, right? So give me an example of a speech act. An apology, a request, a compliment, anything, whatever it is that the language is doing in the real world, right? And the way that these are described in speech act theory is by 3 acts, right, or 3 effects. So the locutionary act is the actual language that's used. So if you're apologizing, it's the actual I am sorry, the pronoun, the verb, and the adverb, right? So it's the phonetic production of the sounds, the fact of saying the words, and whatever you're referring to in the real world. The illocutionary act is the intent of the speaker, so the action of the speaker. So if the speaker is saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that, we assume that their intent is, yeah, that they're sorry, right? That they're apologizing, right? But you can think of contexts in which that would not be true, right? So in what context might you say, might the locution sound like you're being sorry, but the illocution, you're not sorry?
I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave.
Okay. Although that's sort of, yeah, that's an interesting one, actually. Because the truth is that you're ordering them to leave. Yeah, good. I was thinking of more, but that's good. I was thinking more of something like, oh, I'm sorry. Which, yeah, right, which clearly means you're not sorry, right? You're angry for some reason. And then a perlocutionary act, the effect that the utterance has on its audience or the consequences of the speech act itself, right? So examples are, for example, being persuaded, threatened, amused, bored, happy. Perlocutionary acts also include the intended effects on the audience, meaning that one may succeed or fail to achieve one's perlocutionary goal. So if I'm intending to apologize to you, but for some reason it doesn't come across as an apology, then I'm not achieving the perlocutionary effect, right? So that's like a speed read through speech act theory that you would spend a lot more time on if you were in pragmatics. But one of the important things for discourse analysis is the importance between direct and indirect speech acts, right? Because that's how do you, somehow our interpretations are bounded so that we understand what an indirect act is and what a direct act is, right? And so why, in what ways are they bounded? So if you have something like, can you pass the salt? The doesn't mean can you, like physically can you, right? There is an assumption that you are able to, right? The utterance force is actually in the request itself, right? And we know that. We know that. And why do we know that? Because we're operating under something that so-called felicity conditions, okay? And felicity conditions vary depending upon what your speech act is. But in this case, we've looked at felicity conditions for a request. So what has to be true, in other words, in order for this to be interpreted as a request and well, interpreted it, so understood as a request and able to be a speech action. So it's a potential request if it's something that we want to happen. We want the salt, right? It's a potential request only if the speaker believes the requestee can do it, right? So if I know that you are unable to pass the salt, physically unable, then I'm obviously asking you something else, right? I'm obviously doing something else with that utterance. I don't know what. I can't imagine what I'd be doing. Laughing at you that you had no arms and you couldn't. I don't really know. I don't, you know, but
both arms are in cast. And then
yeah, both arms are in cast, right? That was the thing. Yeah. So then it's not a request. What is it then? Yeah, then it's some kind of joke, right? Some kind of humor marker. Yeah. And it's a potential request only if the speaker intentionally means it to be interpreted that way, okay? Again, if your arms are in cast, as you say, and you can't do it, then obviously I don't mean it to be interpreted that way. So the idea of felicity conditions in speech act theory is that we're all operating under this same set of bounded guidelines, which is why we can understand what's direct and what's indirect. Now, we are actually going to look at some examples where it gets a lot more tricky because you can't necessarily, if you're a second language speaker, you can't necessarily work out what the interpretation should be. And this is partly because indirect acts tend to conventionalize. So different languages will ask them different ways, right? They can tend to conventionalize or use idiomatic language. And once they've become idiomatic, that's when it might become tricky for a non-native speaker or someone outside of the speech community to understand what the interpretation is supposed to be. So there's some examples in your book Page 78. Oh yeah, this was my personal favorite, was page 78. C. Let's read this out. Let's have Mimi be the mother and Jade be the daughter.
Whose jacket is this?
Your mind must be starting to go, Mom. Don't you remember you bought it for me a month ago?
When I say whose jacket is this, I really mean come here and hang it up.
How about when you say answer the door? Do you really mean pass the potatoes?
What do you suppose I mean when I say watch your step, kiddo?
Right. So it's a classic example, right? Of and then obviously the humor is that we all know, otherwise it wouldn't be funny, right? If we couldn't all interpret that the same way using the felicity conditions or the underlying bounded interpretation, then it wouldn't be funny, right?
I didn't get the B one.
Oh, B.
Yeah, I didn't understand that.
B. A man is dozing on the sofa. From the other room, Bob the garbage. The caption, take as directed. So take as directed is the caption you put on medicine. Yeah, so I assume this is like take as directed. It's a sort of play on take as directed, right? Consider yourself to now be directed to do the garbage, right? So it's not a statement, it's a direction, you know, to do it. So what, I don't know what you do in your house. In our house, I started this thing where I say, oh, someone needs to be the garbage fairy. And that means, you know, or if he actually takes it out, when I'm like, oh, you were the garbage fairy. That's great. There's always something usually to do with garbage when you're living with someone else, with a family, because there's always garbage and no one particularly wants to take it out. So do you guys have any ones that you use in your family, or who comes to God now? Oh, you're also nice. Wow.
There's the direct. Take it out now.
Take it out. Yeah, right. So this is right. Good. So what I mean is, that's my indirect way, is saying someone needs to be the garbage fairy, right? So I don't say take the garbage out. Yeah.
Or like when I was as a kid in the house, my mom would be like, there is no Cinderella in this house.
Ah, lovely. Perfect. Yeah, right. There is no Cinderella in this house.
When like
right.
the whole living room was a mess.
Yeah. Meaning one of you people needs to clear this up. Right. Good. I like that. Is that a saying from Mexico, or?
I don't think so.
Oh,
No.
There's no Cinderella in this house. I love that. Yeah. All right. Good. Good. Okay. So we can see how that works. Dongwei Cheng, Dr. Cheng, actually did a study in 2017 looking at, and you can look that up from her CV and see where it was. I forget now where it's published, somewhere good. So I wanted to use a couple of examples from hers of specifically speech acts and what apologies were rated highly. So what apologies people thought were good and why they were good, and what apologies people thought were bad and why they were bad. And there were native speakers and non-native speakers. And in general, the non-native speakers were evaluated as less successful in terms of their apologies than the native speakers. So let's have a look at some of these examples and think about why that is. So here's a native speaker apology. So they have the same thing they had to apologize for. Hello, Dr. Smith. I'm so sorry about missing our appointment earlier. I would still like to talk with you about this matter, but I understand if you do not wish to schedule another appointment, I will stop by your office during your office hours. Again, I apologize for missing our appointment. Thank you for your time, Mary. Okay, so that was rated, what do you think? Very highly. Yeah, that was rated very highly. And why was that rated highly?
Because she used the strategies like, she accepted that it was her fault, and she actually used the expression of apology, sorry, and apologized 2 times. And also she is not imposing anything. Like, I will stop by your office hour, but
Excellent.
I don't want you to do any extra thing for me.
Good.
I know how to do it wrong.
So she's explicitly apologizing, saying explicitly sorry. She's taking responsibility for what happened, making that clear. And then there's no imposition on the person who was waiting for her to show up, right? And also the salutations are good, right? Hello, Dr. Smith. Thank you for your time, right? I just received an email from a graduate student, not anybody in here, this morning with no salutation at all, just like da-da-da,
I get
question marks. And I'm like, yeah, I sort of expect it from undergraduates.
Yeah.
I sort of don't expect it from graduate students and a native speaker, not a non-native speaker. So I was surprised. Yeah.
Maybe they were in a rush.
Yeah. Well, but even though you're in a rush, being in a rush doesn't prevent you from thinking about context, right? Or it shouldn't really. Now, I think it's also true that things are changing. Conventions are changing, and I try and do better at having less salutations and less, but I find it quite difficult. Just writing Lucy instead of best Lucy or best wishes Lucy or something. Just writing Lucy instead, which a lot of people do now, work email, not students, but work. I can't do it. I have to put best or something. It just seems, wrong. So, yeah, good. That's exactly correct. So this is one of the reasons why the people said that they thought this was good. Culturally, it's more acceptable to talk about what can be done. So she talks about what can be done. Can I come to your office hours again? Instead of why an assignment was submitted late. This is a different thing, but you get the idea. Full responsibility is more appealing to a professor than the reasons why something, right? So it's this idea of apologizing and no imposition. These ones were both rated low. I was supposed to ask you that, but never mind. One is a native speaker and one's a non-native speaker. So let's start with the native speaker. Dear Professor Smith, I regrettably missed the lecture today and would like to make it up. Is there any way we could meet during your office hours so you can help me? If not, at the very least, email me the notes so I can review it myself.
At the very least.
Wow.
I can't get that.
Okay, so that's bad, right? We're all going, oh, why are we all going, oh?
At the very least is like.
What does it imply? What we were talking about before?
It's an imposition.
Yeah, it's an imposition, right? And it's an inappropriate. It's an inappropriate imposition, and in addition, it's expressed even more inappropriately.
Sounds a little
right?
bit arrogant too.
It's
at the very least.
it is expressed. Yeah. Is it?
Send me the notes.
It's expressed. The imposition itself is not good, and the expression of the imposition, at the very least, is also not good, right? So. Here's the Arabic one, non-native speaker one. Hi, Dr. Smith, how are you? Hope you have a nice day. I really email you because I've missed an important lecture, and as you know, the next 2 weeks we will start the final exams. I've seen all my friends, and nobody was taking notes or anything else, which I love. Would you mind repeat the lecture again or give me a brief summary of the lecture, because I really need it as soon as possible to study it for the exam. So what's the problem here?
This is funny.
Well, yeah.
I see my friends, nobody was.
I know, this cracks me up,
Ruined it
actually.
all.
This sort of cracks me up. Nobody was taking notes or anything. Everyone's like,
Just threw everybody.
was like, he lectured? I didn't notice anybody lecturing. Yeah, it was, yeah, that's fine.
It's
Okay.
also kind of like, it's not my fault, you know?
Yeah, so there's a problem here in the expression, right? What's the problem? If we understand that, but what else is the problem with the expression?
It's like informal. There's no hierarchy, like as if this person is just emailing another student.
Okay,
It's not respect.
okay. What gives you that impression, Nana? What makes you feel that way about the language?
The grammar, the mistakes like capital letters.
Okay, good.
No, like the salutation right on the same line. There's no ending.
good,
Um,
good. These are all issues that people found problematic. Okay. What else is the problem in terms of the imposition? Yeah, tell me about why is this imposition too great?
As requesting explicitly that he repeats the lecture.
Yeah, yeah. So would you mind repeat the lecture again or give me a brief summary? Now, I was really ticked the other day when we did a 2-hour class and none of my thing was recorded, right? To a point where we went and we had a meeting with IT, me, Hunter and Sal, the day afterwards to say, this is not acceptable. So the fact that, we have repeat the lecture again and give me a brief summary is ridiculous, right? I mean, who's gonna...
You're the queen.
Yeah. Who's gonna do that?
Personalized. like,
No one's gonna do that.
Yeah.
So,
Entitled.
so there's, so let's look at so they were both rated badly, and let's see what the comments were. So, yeah. So here's the first one, at the very least catches me off guard. Like, it's my job to make sure they get the notes when they can get them from a classmate, right? So that's just completely inappropriate. But interestingly, something that I wouldn't be surprised from an undergraduate student, actually. I don't know if any of you have had this.
Yeah,
a lot.
it's because in
A lot,
high school
yeah.
they're used to having the teacher send them reminders and things like that, so they come to college with that same mindset that
Right.
if they missed the lesson, that the teacher was gonna.
It's
Supplement.
like something, it is like very cultural, it's a very cultural thing, because you cannot see such thing in undergrads in my country. It's like never ever such thing ever happens. Like the
Yes,
apologies,
because
like
the position
a
of things.
lot, like they apologize like zillion times, and they want to make sure that everything is like, oh yeah, like.
So this would, and you're saying, Lucy, this would not happen in your country either?
Yes,
From an
yes.
undergraduate student?
Even for high school students.
Yeah, even high school.
Because
so,
teacher
Wow.
and student, they are not
Yeah.
in the same position, they are much higher.
Mhm.
So no student will do this kind of things.
Right.
They will show as much politeness as
And
possible.
respect as possible?
Yes.
Nana?
Same.
Same.
And it's more like they know that it's their responsibility to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, this was the same for me when I was an undergrad, but I sometimes, that was like 30 years ago, so I don't know if that's the same in England anymore. Sandy?
Same thing, like it was back in the day, it was very
Yeah.
respect, but now we're being so much influenced with the US.
Yeah, who knows? Right. Well, I had Sal talk to you in the lab meeting today about student behavior, who's like, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, we're about that time in the semester where if you're teaching undergraduates, some of you are thinking, oh my gosh, who do these people think I am? What is going on here, in terms of role relationships.
Right.
Even more significant if you're a second language speaker or you're perceived as maybe a second language speaker. It doesn't matter how good your English necessarily is or isn't. That this also, because there's they can then sort of, clearly you're the power in terms of the grade, but they often think that they're more powerful in terms of socio and cultural understanding. So they kind of they can start messing with you. Yeah.
Plus the difference that we talked about in our teaching class last year about their values in terms of education. For here, for them, it's a lot about you have to be fair, and
Yes.
whatever circumstance I am in,
Yes.
everything is gonna be not fair.
Yes, it's true. That's absolutely true. I think in this country, yes, we had when you look at the research, it's fair, kind, and competent. And an American student, I think undergraduate student or even high school student's understanding of fair actually blurs the boundary of authority, in ways that in your countries it might not, there's fair, but then there's also a huge hierarchy. So whatever your professor says goes, you don't. Whereas in this country, the egalitarian idea and the idea of fairness means that you can respect your teacher, but if you think your teacher's making a deliberate horrible mistake, then fairness, allows you to then treat them as though, it was your grandmother or your best friend or something like that. Yeah. So how are you guys doing with your undergraduates? Are they behaving themselves?
But actually, in our 100 class, the first session, we teach them how to email their professors. So just like, and at the end of the
It doesn't work.
yeah, at the end of the semester, it's still the same.
Still the same.
Yeah, but
Ruthie,
like-
you're like, you having some
Just
trouble
like,
with
it's
yours?
not like an email, just like a text message.
Yeah, it's like exactly.
Oh, text message.
Just like that.
Right.
No rating at all, even no signature. So I have to check the email list to see who you are because I don't know.
They don't even put their name on there.
Yes.
Wow.
So it's just like deleting the pronouns and stuff. Can't make it today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. No, it is astonishing. Yeah.
The strange thing here is that I have both American and Korean students in my class, but like my non-native students were like way
Much
politer.
better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sort of
I
like very
taught,
different
English
process.
100 or 31, yes, I had 3 or 4 Korean students,
Korean student.
and they always showed a lot of politeness and respect, no matter in email or even like
Face to face.
face to face. Compared to the native speakers, well,
Yeah, and I think Mimi's right. There's a cultural difference in how teachers behave, expectations that override concerns in other cultures that would be non-overridable, like hierarchical or differences in age, things that in some of our cultures are completely sort of rigid. And in this country, they sort of, at least the undergraduate's perception is that they're kind of can float around there.
very interesting is my student, they thought like I'm like 24 or 25 years old, so they think, okay, you're just like 2 or 3 years older than me.
Right.
I forgot what kind of things I tell them. I'm already 30 years old. Oh my gosh, and they show more respect.
Oh, interesting.
So
interesting.
I find it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because of the
Well,
age, maybe.
Young, my hardest time ever teaching was when I was a young woman. Yeah. When you're in my 20s and 30s. Yeah. By the time you get to my age now, just automatically they're like, oh, we should probably be doing this for a while then. Yeah. So, that's absolutely
So
true.
that is the first time I taught 1301, so I find it's really interesting. So my strategy is to tell them this kind of things at the very beginning of the semester.
Right.
So they will behave much better.
Right. So you're older and a mother. No, that's hard. Yeah. And
Another technique that I don't know if maybe uses it in foreign language that I do is I approach it as even email writing as a learning Spanish thing. I teach them, even Spanish 1, I teach them the greeting and the salutation, the intro and the ending
yeah.
in Spanish, even if the body is in English.
Right.
So it is practice that.
Yeah, good for you.
And for me,
Good
it's
for
really
you.
organic. Like
Yeah.
for them, it's
Yeah.
But the funny thing though is, don't you notice that teaching foreign language to native speakers, the balance is completely different?
I don't have any.
I don't have any-
No, of course not. Right.
At
Because in that
It's
case,
just the
they
same
want you. Yeah,
The
yeah,
same students,
yeah.
and
actually.
the respect is already
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yes.
It triggers the study.
Yeah, right. No, it is. It's because in that case, you're the best possible option. Yeah, because you're the real deal. Yeah.
It goes back to what you were saying about competence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Subject matter.
So, plus, they understand that you're teaching Spanish or teaching French. There's a flexibility in terms of cultural expectation that does not come with teaching English or teaching math or teaching chemistry or, any of those other things. Good. Yeah, so lack of proper punctuation, you mentioned this, and grammar indicates a lack of interest in really succeeding and making a strong impression. We understand that it's a non-native speaker, right? So you don't expect everything to be perfect, but this idea of not capitalizing, of not editing, not rereading your email and doing at least some very basic editing is the problem, right? And this was also about that non-native email. I was very annoyed just reading this. I would likely be a bit harsher than normal with this student. This does not reflect a collegiate level of writing, thought, or respect. Right, so that, yeah. Glad that's not my teacher. Yeah. But, now you see these things are, that's one speech act, right? That's one speech act, one time. The way that a lot of discourse analysis, and we'll look at this with interactional sociolinguistics, the third one, the way a lot of this stuff works is it's a culmination, it's cumulative. So it's not one thing. It's when it keeps going and keeps going and keeps going, and you get more and more irritated and annoyed that this person, in your view, doesn't seem to want to try at all. Yeah. So it's very cumulative. All these things are. Okay, good. So that was speech act theory, and that's what, if you are interested in Dongmei's article, I did not upload it into our thing because you can just get it off of her stuff, but it's an interesting one. The next one that your chapter talks about is Grice's conversational implicature, right? So again, the baseline idea is that we all understand some, and it's arguable in your book. They say that some people now don't like this. They think it's too much of a static framework and it doesn't explain some things. And there's something now called neo-Gricean pragmatics that if we were in a pragmatics class we would look at. But for a very sort of standard understanding of what's going on in the world, I think we can all see the strengths in having a model, even if something goes wrong every now and then, the truth is most of the time it's sort of going right, which means we must all be following some bounded interpretation. However, it might look different from this, or people might say, well, I'm not sure that occurs every time or all the time. We can use it as a basic framework, right? Otherwise, we'd all be asking each other all the time what we meant by something, which we do a lot, but we don't do all the time. So this is the cooperative principle, which some of you have done in pragmatics. Basically, Grice said, who apparently was not a very nice man, I've just discovered. He was British and unpleasant and a womanizer. I know. I was like, oh, that's a disappointment because I really like the conversational implication model. So make your conversational contribution such as required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk or exchange in which you are engaged. So that's the cooperative principle, and it breaks down into these 4 maxims. First one is relevance. So speak to the point, right? Make your contribution match the context in which it appears. Quality, tell the truth. Quantity, say enough, not too much or not too little. So for example, if someone says, oh, you have a sister, you might say, yeah, I do have a sister and I have a brother, you know, because it might strike you as relevant that, you know, that you describe all your siblings. That wouldn't be considered to be too much. Manner, be clear, be orderly, be idiomatic, just meaning follow the order in which your speech community would expect something to happen. So, so there's problems with some of these, right? Particularly if you say quality and you take it literally all of the time, right? Because tell the truth depends on a lot of things, right? In some cases, it is not relevant to tell the truth, right? In fact, you specifically don't want to tell the truth, okay? So the 2 things have happened. One is neo-Gricean, another one is a focus explicitly on what's called relevance theory. So that theory, if anybody's interested in doing more work with pragmatics, basically smudges all the rest of the maxims under relevance and says once you conceive of relevance as a very broad framework, all that goes inside, because what we're really talking about is relevance to context, right? So there are lots of different ways in which you can violate these maxims, right? Failure to observe these maxims. And the fact that we recognize that there are general ways, I know I keep going on about this, but it's important. The fact that we recognize there are general ways in which these can be violated or fail to observe shows you that there's some underlying system that we're working from for the most part. Because if we couldn't work out when it was being not observed, then it would be a crapshoot, right? It would be a 50-50 shot, but it isn't a 50-50 shot. We're pretty clear on what's happening when it's not observed, right? So one is a straight up and down violation. This is my personal favorite because I hated this so much. This is when I was in school, I put my hand up and said, can I go to the bathroom? And my teacher said, I don't know, can you? Which is just, at the time, I knew something was horribly wrong, but I didn't have enough linguistics to explain to him why that was a horrible thing to do. Many times I have gone back in my mind to give him a real piece of my mind. So that's a basic violation, right? He knew that was not what I was asking. And I think that's why I was so traumatized by the experience, because we're not used to people violating it, right? Without just for fun, or to make me feel bad, or yeah, it was a really ways to do things with language that hurt, right? Opting out is another one. Refusal to continue to communicate for fear of having to violate. So that can be very serious or very benign. You know, if someone says, so I look great in this dress, right? And you don't want to violate truth, but you also can't bring yourself to say, yes, go down the aisle in that dress. You might just sort of go, oh. So basically, you're not entirely opting out in that you're sending a message, but you're not going to say, yes, absolutely, or, you know.
Wonderful.
yeah, I just can't. This again, two maxims, so it's very similar to this idea of clash, two maxims. So that would be quantity and truth, right? So you'd go, which isn't exactly very good in terms of quantity. It's not as much as they would probably want you to say, but it's as much as you're prepared to say on the basis of the clash. And then flouting, which is blatantly failing to fulfill. So again, you can think of examples where you are flouting for a very specific reason. Okay, it's obvious that you're not fulfilling the speech act, right? The implicature. Yeah. So the fact that we know that this is going on, that we're aware, not that we're aware of like, oh, someone just flouted my speech act, but the fact that we're aware, our sort of antennae goes up, shows that we're aware on some level that these expectations are what we think should be happening. So we haven't done very much as a field with implicature and non-native speakers. We know that implicature is conventionalized. So back here, when we wrote here, down here, be orderly, be idiomatic, right? We know that implicature is conventionalized. People understand what's going on within their own language. But we haven't really done much in terms of trying to understand what people understand and what people don't understand. So this is some examples from a study done by an author called Kim in 2012, who is trying to see how much intermediate to advanced students understood about implicature. So she would have a implicature like Frank, a situation which had an implicature. So Frank is a big sports fan. Jim, did you see the game last week? Frank, is the Pope Catholic? Right? So what does that mean?
First one?
Yeah, no, just that thing, that whole thing. Yes, right, the first one, right? So because what does that actually mean?
The implicature, it implies
Yeah.
that, of course.
Of course, right, good. So the implicature is, of course, I saw the game. I'm a rabid sports fan, so why would you even ask me? Because, of course, you know, the Pope is Catholic, right? So they then got this choice, right? But then they also had to give a step-by-step explanation of how they made that choice, right? So the choice was Frank saw the game. Frank did not see the game. Frank wants to know if the Pope is Catholic. Frank is more interested in religion than sports. So they picked an A, B, C, or D, and then they had to explain why they picked that. So and it turned out that only about 50% of these implicatures were understood.
She studied native or native?
No, these are non-native speakers. These are Koreans learning English, right? So, but like most of it, you know, literally half of them are going like nothing. They've got no idea what's going on. So here's an example. Did you see, is the Pope Catholic? So here's the step that they took to understand the implicature. When people take part in the Pope Catholic ceremony, they feel it's too long or peaceful and boring. Because Frank is a big sports fan, he saw the game and was disappointed that the game was boring. Yeah. So that's quite a detailed implicature, actually. Completely wrong. But yeah. Frank is a big sports fan. So Frank sees all the sports games if it's not prohibited. Frank thinks only that the Pope is Catholic, so he's prohibited from seeing sports games. Yeah. Again, quite a complicated implicature to make from that, but they do it. What's interesting is they try and make it work. Like, you know, they assume it must mean something meaningful, so they try and make it work. So there's a few studies like this. When you do the pragmatics class with me, those of you who haven't done it yet, we look at this, and we look at a couple of other studies that are similar. But generally speaking, implicature, idiomaticity, these things, we just hope that people kind of glean as time goes on. We have second language learners all over the room. Is there anything that you can think of, any experience where you think you've missed it, or it's become complicated, or nothing? It's hard, I know, to think of things when you
It happened, but I can't think of it.
yeah, right. You know that it's happened to you. Yeah.
I'd be interested to have somebody do a study of like native speakers as well, to see if they all get the implicature too, because I think some of the implicature may be based on like inside jokes and specific, even within a culture, specific.
Yes, certainly within a speech community.
Yeah.
That's absolutely
So
correct.
It might be that
Yeah.
maybe 80% will get it and 20 might not.
Yeah, I would be surprised if this wasn't broad enough to encompass the whole North American speech community. But I don't know how it would go down with Anglophone African. Would it work?
It would depend on the country,
Yeah, okay.
because even within the country, there's so many other native languages. that
Right. Yeah, who knows?
Like
Yeah.
how strong the
It will
language.
be,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
difficult to say.
I mean, this works in, I think I would be surprised if it didn't work in regular traditional English communities, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't work in New English communities that speak New Englishes.
So then that backs the critique that people have on the speech act theory and Grice's maxims that it's westernized.
Yes, right. In this particular case, it's because most implicatures, when we look at them, we begin from our own cultural standpoint, right? So the examples, the research, the studies has all been, for the most part, Western oriented. And that is a problem. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that if you go up one level to the meta level and say, but are other cultures processing things in a similar way, just obviously using different reference and so on, that doesn't necessarily mean we've got a problem there, right? But what it does mean is that this is one of the reasons they redid the whole TOEFL, because the TOEFL is full of this stuff. The TOEFL test is full of implicatures. It's full of things like discussion of baseball games or, you know, all kinds of things. And they really had to go through and strip as much of that stuff out as they could, because it became an issue of how well, you know, you understood American English convention and implicature, right? Which is not what the TOEFL is supposed to be. So it's better now. I haven't looked at it for a while, but it's still problematic. Yeah, it's still problematic. Because there might be certain things that, so for example, if you think of this one, comparing sports and religion, that might be something that in another culture would not exist, right? I mean, you couldn't you couldn't do that.
Or you couldn't joke with people.
Yeah, I mean, you just couldn't. Right? It's not a possible joke, you know. So then in that case, how are people supposed to understand the implicature, right? Because they're like, you know, there's no level on which this could possibly be. So then they try and find another meaning, which is what these students were doing. Yeah. So another article that I've done in pragmatics that you guys might remember if you've done pragmatics, a colleague of mine studied refusals in Arabic and used some different situations. And one of the situations was you refuse your boss invites you to lunch or dinner or something with your family and you refuse. How would you refuse? And you know, all the Arabic students said you wouldn't refuse. Yeah, I mean it's just not something that you refuse, right? So so then they said, well, imagine that you would refuse. And of course, at that point, then you get into this problem, this issue of, well, now you're completely outside the realm of how that language and context works in that speech community. Yeah, so it's, of course, a waste of time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, the last approach it looked at is interactional sociolinguistics, and this is what I do. This was started by John Gumperz, who's there, who died when did he die? No, 2000 and something. Anyway,
13.
2013, thank you very much. 2013. Awesome guy. Super interested in what happened when cultures clashed. You know, when ideas of communication across discourse and pragmatics clashed. So this is the work that I've been doing. And essentially you start out in sociolinguistics, you start out with some, again, these basic background assumptions. And again, we can argue that they may not be as static or as framed as they're presented here. But to begin with, let's start from this idea. So that within the same speech community, so me talking to someone else from my speech community, so let's just say British English, at least Southern British English, maybe not Northern, but Southern. We have an assumption of what we call a mutual code. So if I want to converge with you, which is what we do as speakers all the time, right? We try and converge rather than diverge, right? If we're diverging, that means that there's a problem. Something's going wrong, someone's upset with somebody. So what we normally do is converge toward each other. So we assume that there's a mutual code in terms of how you say that you understand the information and how you're getting along with each other, right? So we have a mutual code to say, yes, this is going well. I like you, I'm having this conversation. Yes, I understand you informationally, right? And that has an acceptance of lots of implied meanings, some of which we've just looked at in terms of indirect speech acts and so on, right? And this reliance on these implied meanings or inferences is from our background knowledge, right? It's because I've been communicating with speakers of Southern British English my entire life, right? I grew up in that community. I understand that we're all sort of coming from the same place. And that we use routine formulas to express that. That goes back to that idea of be idiomatic, right? We often don't explicitly say something. We use routines or formulaic language or idiomatic language and people understand what it is that we want, okay? And these routine formulas, inferences, or clues, or cues, come in all parts of the discourse message. So we listen as we're listening and we're interacting with someone, we're watching these contextualization cues, right? They're tacit, conventionalized choices. Tacit means they're underlying. You don't think about them. So again, it's like, can you imagine an alarm bell? You say something, the person that you're talking to says something, and an alarm goes off, right? You're like, wait, why is this now weird? They were too loud, they didn't look at me, they didn't follow a whole range, they didn't smile, they didn't follow a whole range of cues that I would expect in this situation, in my context, right? So Sal does it all the time in restaurants. He never smiles. And it really upsets the waitresses because they think they've done something wrong. Like he just sort of, they look at him and say, how are you? And he says, okay. And they're like, you know, you can tell that just in that two utterances, it's all going wrong, right? Because they're like, okay, he's not okay. What have I done already? Oh God, this is going to be really hideous. Oh Lord, I'm probably not going to get a tip. You know, you can see it's all sort of going through their heads to a point where Sal's daughter and I won't let him talk to waitstaff if we're with him in the restaurant. We talk to the waitstaff for him. And the reason that happens in two utterances is because these are tacit. Okay, you're not the waitress. Oh, the waitstaff is not thinking. Now he needs to smile. Now he needs to look at me. Now he needs to, you know. But there's an alarm bell that goes off that says that something's not quite right. And that's what Gumperz was interested in, essentially. How do we know when there's an alarm bell? Where do the alarm bells come from? And what happens when they go off, right? So the way he did this was this idea of contextualization cues. So think of it as these inferences, these clues that we have. So we're both following them. And if we're from the same community, we're both understanding them, right? And it comes through every part of the linguistic system. So it's interpretation of cues or devices throughout. So that can be in the grammar, in the lexicon, in the prosody or the intonation, or in the paralinguistic. So in the smiling behaviors, gesture behavior, eye gaze behavior, it appears all over, right? And for their interpretation, production and interpretation, we rely on our previous experience, our shared linguistic and sociocultural background, right? So the idea is that if you're with someone in your own speech community, this shouldn't be going wrong on a regular basis, right? This should be it. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't misunderstand each other, but this shouldn't be something, again, think of it in terms of it's not a 50-50 shot, right? It's not like, is this person understanding me or do they think I'm horrible or whatever? If you're within the same speech community, we assume an underlying understanding of this, right? So what he said is over time they become these tacit, conventionalized or idiomatic choices that we just anticipate, okay? So tacit in the case of things like intonation, which is the ones I study, that we don't even say to ourselves, oh, that intonation clue was wrong, right? This is why I feel like upset, because that all we know is we feel upset. Something just happened, an alarm bell went off, and we just don't know why, right? There's a video, a great video, where which I still only have on video, unfortunately, but it's an interview between a head principal of a school and a father, and it's a genuine interview, and right at the beginning, she sits down and says, you know, good to see you. And which she doesn't mean, of course, but because it's about to be a horrible interview and she knows it, but he does nothing. He doesn't look at her. He doesn't return her greeting. He doesn't do anything. So immediately now the stakes are higher, and we've gotten to that alarm bell went off, and she's like, okay, something. So now she's worried, right, about what's going to happen. And that's what Gumprez was really interested in. He was interested in what happens when this happens, particularly for people with no power. So he was particularly interested in immigrants in a new country. So who would come to that country with these different contextualization cues, and that these contextualization cues may clash with the people in power, and that instead of being recognized for what they were as linguistic devices, other things get interpreted, right? This person is mean, this person is confused, this person is unqualified, this person is, and that was really his interest, and is also mine, which is why I use the model. So this is again to give you an indication of how it goes across the discourse, right? It's not just one system. So he was particularly interested in different ways of speaking, the use of different sets of unconscious linguistic conventions, such as tone of voice, for example, to emphasize, to signal logical connections, to indicate the significance of what had been said in terms of overall meaning and attitudes. Now, what he said, one of the most important cues, contextualization cues, was prosody, was intonation. And he said that was because it was so tacit. It's so underlying. You respond immediately, you respond emotionally. Now, since then, there's been a lot of work on this idea of fetuses in utero actually being able to understand, actually responding to the intonation of their native language versus the intonation of another language. So it does seem to be that this is something that's very sort of tacit inside us, that we, instead of thinking, oh, that was a weird intonation, we think, oh, why does this person sound so angry, right? So he said that because of this underlying tacit nature, if you have miscues, so if you're cueing incorrectly within that speech community and that context, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, okay? A speaker is then said to be unfriendly, maybe, impertinent, rude, uncooperative, fail to understand. It's regarded as a social faux pas, leads to misjudgments of speaker intent, not likely to be identified as a mere linguistic error. And this is what he was so super interested in terms of discourse, right? Because if you also think about it, as we said before, as cumulative effect, okay, as you go through the discourse, this is getting worse and worse, right? Because as each miscue hits, your interlocutor is making more and more assumptions about who you are and what it is that you mean. In addition, often to being confused by the information, because the information is being presented in ways that they don't understand. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. This is an example from the difference between a North American or British English speaker, so this would be traditional English speakers, versus a new English speaker, in this case, an Indian English speaker. So in this case, we're talking about confusion with information structuring. If I, as a British English speaker, say to somebody, my phone number is 3784243, and this person repeats 3788243, I will say no, 3784243, right? I will have a contrastive stress on the incorrect digit, okay? What happens in Indian English is there is no contrastive stress. So I say 3784243, B says 3788243, no, 3784243 is what Gumpress said would happen, right? And so when I was in Georgia, I thought, well, that's easy to test. So I tested it, and this is what you're looking at as the test. And for some reason it got flipped.
Wow.
So this is the North American speaker, okay? So the North American speaker says, and this is the intonation. So the North American speaker says 8349578, right? And then when repeating it, look at what happens to the intonation here. This is the contrastive stress. So now it's 834, right? With a huge low drop. So in the first time it's 4, and the second time it's 4, right? Because you're showing that that's the strong one. And if you look at the Indian English, it's 8349578, and it's 8349578. It's exactly the same. So it's really interesting because it's a very small, tiny example, but it's one of the reasons that information structure starts to get difficult in the discourse, because if you have a few miscues like this, things that should be happening that you're expecting to happen and don't happen, things start to get complicated to listen to. So this is one cue. Now, what happens obviously in the discourse is you have cues in the intonation, cues in the grammar, cues in the paralinguistics, cues in the lexicon. So the question comes, what happens if can you ignore one cue basically and like rely on the others, was something I was interested in. And it turns out that that's not what we do. What we do is we try and integrate all the cues across the systems. We want them to all match each other, which in this case it does, right? We repeat the item, we repeat the lexical item, repeat the grammar, and we add the contrastive stress. So if the cues do not match each other, we are not good at pulling out the one that didn't match, if you see what I mean. What we do instead is start getting confused, okay? And that's because discourse, spoken discourse particularly, has a huge amount of redundancy built in. And we can see that just by what happens to you on the phone, right? On the phone, you lose some of that redundancy because you can't see the person's face, you can't see any of their paralinguistic behaviors, so you start to lose some of the redundancy. And that redundancy, those multiple cues, is what's important, because we can't separate them out and say, well, that one is, the syntax is probably right, but maybe the intonation is wrong, or vice versa, right? Which is the problem, especially as it's cumulative, because it keeps on trucking. This is another example. This is an example I use in my textbook on intonation. This is an example from England. So I'm just going to read it because it should be straightforward. It focuses on intonational conventions, describes how unexpected. So this is what he did, by the way. He went into the workplace a lot and he tried to work out. In this particular case, he was invited in because there were so many problems in the workplace between these women and the people they were serving. And this is, so he came and he described this linguistic pattern. So describes how the unexpected intonation patterns of Indian and Pakistani English in a workplace cafeteria in Britain caused them to be perceived as uncooperative. The incidents occurred in a cafeteria in Heathrow, in which Indian and Pakistani women were serving meals to a British English-speaking population of supervisors and cargo handlers. And these women were being perceived as surly and uncooperative, and this was becoming a real problem. So Gumprez went in and started observing some of their interactions. And one thing that was clear, I'm not necessarily saying all this has to do with this, but one thing that was clear was that there was different conventional uses of rising and falling intonation patterns between, so traditional English, which would be British English, and a new English, in this case Indian English. A lot of work's done with Indian English in Britain because it's our largest minority population by far. It's huge. And in fact, may not even be as minority as it used to be. For example, to ask a cargo handler if he wanted gravy with his meat, a British English-speaking worker would say, gravy, using a rising intonation. Whereas an Indian English speaker says gravy, using a falling intonation. This was interpreted as a demand from the worker rather than an offer, and was perceived by the British English speakers as rude. So they perceived this intonation as being a deliberate choice in a system they understood. And this is what's significant, right? If we go back to this idea that you have a tacit system, this inferencing system that you don't really understand, like you know, it's just there, right? Then you assume that the other person is following the same interpretation. Then naturally it leads you to believe that they're doing this deliberately, right? And if they're doing this deliberately, why would they be doing this? What would be, why might they be deliberately being like that?
Showing that, like, okay, you think that we are lower than you, but like we're not.
Right. Maybe they're like being, you know, I don't care what you think of me, you know. In fact, this whole thing was interpreted as racism on both sides, both Indian and Pakistani women and the British cargo handlers said that the other group was demonstrating uncooperative, angry, racist behaviors. Yeah. So they did some work with the ways of speaking, and this is a quote from Gumprez's work. When the Indian women heard this, they began to understand the reactions they'd been getting all along, which had until then seemed incomprehensible. They then spontaneously record intonation patterns which had seemed strange to them, spoken by native English speakers, and at the same time, supervisors learned that the Indian women's falling intonation was their normal way of asking questions, and that no rudeness and indifference was intended. So it's a fairly classic example of what we're talking about. It's an intonational cue as opposed to a grammatical cue or a lexical cue, but it's this idea that interpretation, again, it's not a 50-50 shot. The guy didn't think, oh, she's asking me gravy, maybe she's being rude to me, maybe she isn't. The guy thinks, this person is being rude to me, why are they being rude to me, right? Questions?
Maybe could it have been Because as you said, it's not dependent on one cue, it's all of it
Right.
cumulative. So maybe they were avoiding eye contact or
Right.
facial expression, all of that. Plus, they were saying gravy instead of gravy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that they were working on, but yeah, we do know that miscues, discourse miscues are cumulative. They happen across time and they may happen across systems, and we're not able to sort it out. So there was a problem, I think in the 1970s in this country, in the Little Korea, either California or New York, where Korean female shopkeepers put change on the table rather than giving it to the person by hand because it wasn't right to touch a man's hand, whatever. So they would put the money down on the tabletop. And this was perceived by the customers as being incredibly rude, right? That they, so then you start making stuff up, basically. You start interpreting behaviors in ways. Do you hear
That would
about
not be
this?
rude at all to me. I mean, the person at least didn't throw the coin away.
No. But they put it on in this country, if I ask for change, I can't remember the last time I used cash, so I guess things are changing. But, I put my hand out for the change and expect you to put the change in my hand. We might briefly, it's not like we're going to, but it's okay if we sort of, whereas that totally was not okay. So they would put it nice enough, but they would put it on the thing, but it's like, what, I'm holding out my hand, you put it on the counter, and I'm like,
You might as well throw it on the floor.
yeah, like, what am I, chopped liver? Yeah, that is the problem. Yeah, that is the problem, because the perception is not, all this is, it's insane, right? It's insane that this is the kinds of, but then it doesn't take much to tip you over into thinking, well, what's wrong with these people? Something else happens, they say something, they don't look at you when you think, and before you know it, you've got a whole, narrative in which these people don't like you and you don't like them, right? The latest version of this, something that I've been very interested in, are people that worked initially with John Gumprez, much later, and now working in England, and they have conceptualized this as something they call the linguistic penalty, which is something that they say is faced by many transnationals who interview for jobs for which they are professionally qualified. Again, the basis of these studies was in England, so mainly Indian English people coming in. And they note that it arises not from a lack of fluency in English, but from largely hidden demands to talk in institutionally credible ways, particularly communicative styles that may be at odds with their interviewers. So the important thing about the linguistic penalty is to help explain why a lot of immigrant workers reach a glass ceiling that then they can't seem to break through because maybe their communication styles are at odds with the other people that are working around them. And also to help explain why qualified people, qualified immigrants, are often devalued regardless of their qualifications, when they come up for interview. So by analogy to the ethnic penalty, this might be termed as the linguistic penalty. Different ethnic groups, whether they use English as their heritage language or not, so that would be, for example, the Indian English speakers, may use culturally specific styles of communication that are different from local or standard English. Differences include a range of rhetorical and self-presentational features, including things such as intonation and rhythm. So this sort of conceptualizes the what it is we're talking about in terms of discourse presentation, right? And what can happen to you. Now, obviously, it depends on what you know, we were just saying earlier on. If somebody wants to learn Spanish and you're a native Spanish speaker, they love you, right? That's great. But the linguistic penalty might kick in if it's something else, right? Well, it does kick in with ITAs particularly. All right. So before we go to the reading post, any questions or comments? Yeah, maybe.
This stuff is interesting. And
It is interesting stuff.
It
I'm
looks
glad you
like
like.
there's research that says that there's a range of these features, the cues that
Yes.
manifest
Yes.
themselves. But I'm interested to know if there has been research that has already established that there is a correlation between these cues. Like maybe someone has established, okay, when they avoid this or they make this particular gesture, like you talked about the money thing, plus they use this intonation of voice, or they use this particular prosodic feature plus this, it means that how they arrive at the conclusion.
Yeah, Gumprich has done a lot of work on that. He looks at, and it's unfortunate that I can't, all this stuff I have on video because it was in the 80s, and we tried to turn it onto, I should see if I can get that DVD to work. We tried to turn it into a DVD and it didn't go very well because the video wasn't that great to start with. If I haven't looked on YouTube, I should probably look and check that there's nothing there. But he did that. He actually, that was one of the things that he demonstrated. He had a very short interaction between a British, white, Southern British speaking customer and a bank clerk just to open a bank account. And then he had the exact same interaction between a Indian English speaker and the same bank clerk, and pointed out the combination of ways in which this was going wrong. And it was a combination of syntactic choices, intonational choices, not looking at him when he expected him to. So this notion of a constellation of cues is very important. One of the reasons that I spent a lot of time focusing on intonational cues was that was the left out one a lot of the time. And the reason that was left out was because people weren't sure how systematic intonation was. Now we can show that intonation is as systematic as any other linguistic system. Now we can show that work. But a lot of the work in Gumprich's model, if you go back to the work in the 80s, it was with morphosyntax. It wasn't with intonation.
And that's the same person that Deborah Tannen follows. She does.
Yes, Deborah Tannen. The only time I met him was when Deborah Tannen brought him to Georgetown for Deborah Tannen is a fan of interactional sociolinguistics as well.
One question for intonation is cue. So if the person from people from the same speech community, is it possible for them to still have this cue?
Yes, I mean, yes. So we want to be a little careful here because it's any time you're interacting with anyone, occasionally someone will say something and you'll say, "Oh, I didn't mean that," right? So, and that's because there's a lot of ambiguity in the system, and as there is in any linguistic system, So you want some ambiguity in order to maybe take back stuff, but then you want an underlying system that people understand. So it's a constant tension between those two things. But yeah, just the simple fact that someone can say, oh, but I didn't, don't take it like that, I didn't mean it that way, shows you that that's possible.
Yeah, because when I raise someone from China, we share the same first language. So when I read the written ones, I can tell how difference between, native speaker and Chinese speaker. But it's really good. It's okay for me because no offense. But when I hear something,
Right.
I will feel, okay, it's a little strange, or, well, I don't feel that good, but
Yeah.
kind of like different.
Yeah. So and that's and of course China is so interesting from this perspective, because it's like it's dialectology on speed, because it's so depending upon what part of China you're in, and your speech community is super important. And I think that's a very good example of this idea that you are working from some underlying assumptions. So something seems off to you, Now, because you're very clear that, the written code is something that's much clearer than the spoken code, and it's something that Chinese people do, every day, all the time. I think that it's probably less problematic. But, when you start looking at communities like, for example, the vast swathes of mid-America, their speech communities, they're becoming less homogeneous, but they're pretty homogeneous, right? They're sort of, you go to school with the people, you work with the people, they're all the same people. You don't get a rush of people that might communicate differently. So then it becomes a problem, right? Then you start, because you're just assuming, especially spoken communication, it's so quick. It's so, it's spontaneous and it's nebulous. It happens. It just happens and you move on. It's not like anyone's got any time to think, why is this person, oh, wait, maybe they're, what you think is, you're shouting at me. Why are you shouting at me? There's some, one article is the only one I've managed to find, but which I might have talked about in pragmatics, but that Arabic men speak louder than American English men. So if they transfer this loudness of voice, then all of a sudden they sound more aggressive. Yeah. They're not more aggressive, but to a sort of a mid-American attuned ear, all you pick up is, wait, are you being aggressive? And I think for us as ESL teachers, and I say in the book, it's super important for us to understand these things, because we like to think that we're immune from a lot of this. We like to think that we're culturally aware and and I think for the most part we are, a lot more than most other people. But these kinds of things are so tacit that they're happening to you as well. And if you're not careful, they certainly have implications for ease of communication. So it turns out that, it's easier to communicate with student X than it is student Y, and we have to be very careful that this doesn't affect our approaches to our students, because all the research suggests that it does. Even native speaker communities, it does. What's his name? Erickson and Schultz did a whole book on school counselors. I talked about this before. School counselor interaction, where the interaction between so it's a group of the school counselors were part of a speech community in mid-America somewhere that was basically Polish ancestry and white, right? So so they not only had they not only looked similar, but they also had similar kind of childhood experiences and could talk about similar food and so on. And they looked at the school counselors' interaction with those students versus the school counselors that were in their speech community versus the school counselors' interaction with the African American students who were in a different community. And what they found was the interaction was more complicated in terms of interactional features. There were, when the school counselors spoke to those students, and the way they judged this was things like overlaps. So there was more problems with people coming in together. They didn't seem to have a good rhythm of turns. They would make some kind of idiomatic expression to do with, I don't know, maybe food or something, and it wasn't picked up. So then there was a silence, you know, all these kinds of things add up to a perception, you know, a perception of how easy this person is to communicate with. And you have to be aware that you have your own bottom line, you know, that is just as conventionalized as the person that you're talking to. Yeah. But if you're the one that's the gatekeeper, so that book was about, it's called Counselor as Gatekeeper. And it was about how these interactions, these moment by moment miscues can affect what advice, you know, counselors were giving to their high school students and what they thought they were capable of and what they thought they should go for. So, yeah. And that's where it becomes important to think about the linguistic penalty, right? Because it's not too bad if I'm having a misunderstanding with she/her, say, and he's like, why is she being horrible? And I'm like, why is he being difficult? And, you know, who really cares? Well, I guess she-her's a bad example because we are paying him. But, you know, it becomes more and more important the more power differentials are involved. And so when you start talking about job interviews, social security interviews, all these kinds of things, it then starts to become super important. And that's what interactional sociolinguistics really was at its heart. That's what John Gomperz was interested in trying to prevent. He was from Germany, and he was interested in how that was affecting people's lives. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, then in that case, what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to think about this, because we've gone through now speech acts, implicature, and this last one, which is obviously my baby, but interactional sociolinguistics, but you are free to, I want you to really review those three things and look at them in your book. That's the three things that she went through in your book. And discuss any relevant experiences you've had as either a language teacher or learner that fit with any of these three discourse approaches. So now you'll have plenty of time to think about it and think about your own experiences. So, but it could be any of these. It could be a speech act, implicature, like Jade was like, oh, something did happen to me in a picture, but I can't remember what it was now. So it might be that, for example, or the third one. Any of them are good. Questions? We're all good? All right, well, if we're all good, I am done with y'all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.